three common approaches to finding the probability of an event. Now, first we want to take a look at the notation for probabilities. Now, first is the capital letter P denotes a probability. Now, capital letters A, B, and C denote specific events. So therefore, we would say that P with parentheses of A is the same thing as saying the probability of event A occurring. Now, if we take a look at the figure to the right, it shows the possible values of probabilities and the more familiar and common expressions of likelihood. So if you look down here, if we look at the value of 0, that would be impossible. Right above the 0 is unlikely. If we get to the middle, which is 0.5, that's basically saying it's a 50-50 chance. At the very top, if you have 1, that means it's certain, and anything like right before the 1 would be considered likely. Therefore, we would say that the following three approaches for finding probabilities result in values between 0 and 1. So we would say that the probability of event A occurring is between 0 and 1 inclusive. Now let's first take a look at the first one. This is the relative frequency approximation of probability. You conduct or observe a procedure and count the number of times that event A occurs. So the probability of event A occurring is then approximated as follows. We would say that the probability of event A occurring is equal to the number of times A occurred in the numerator divided by the number of times the procedure was repeated in the denominator. Now, when referring to relative frequency approximations of probabilities, this textbook will not distinguish between results that are exact probabilities and those that are approximations. So, an instruction to find the probability could actually mean estimate the probability. Now, the second approach is the classical approach to probability, and this requires equally likely outcomes. If a procedure has n different simple events that are equally likely, and if event A can occur in s different ways, then we would have the following. We would say that the probability of event A occurring is equal to the number of ways A occurs divided by the number of different simple events, which is equal to S over N, where S represents the number of ways A occurs and lowercase n represents the number of different simple events. Now, caution, when using the classical approach, you always want to confirm that the outcomes are equally likely. So when you're seeing that in a question, you want to make sure that it's saying that the outcomes are equally likely. Then you can use this form. The next approach, the third approach, is subjective probabilities. The probability of event A occurring is estimated by using knowledge of relative circumstances. Okay, now let's take a look at three examples in regards to finding the probability. So these are the three approaches to finding the probability. Now, we talked about the first one, which is a relative frequency approach. Now, when trying to determine the probability that an individual car crashes in a year, we must examine past results to determine the number of cars in use in a year and the number of them that crashed. Then we find the ratio of the number of cars that crashed to the total number of cars. So for a recent year, the result is a probability of 0.0480. We will take a look at that in example 3. Now, let's take a look at the next approach, which we talked about, which is the classical approach. When trying to determine the probability of winning the grand prize in the lottery by selecting 6 numbers between 1 and 60, each combination has an equal chance of occurring. So the probability of winning is 0.000000200, which can be found by using methods presented later in this chapter. Next, we have our subjective probability. Now, when trying to estimate the probability of getting stuck in the next elevator that you ride, we know from personal experience that the probability is quite small. So let's estimate it to be, say, 0.001. That's equivalent to 1 chance in 1,000. Now, sometimes none of the preceding three approaches can be used. And if that is the case, then a simulation of a procedure is a process that behaves in the same ways as the procedure itself so that similar results are produced. Probabilities can sometimes be found by using a simulation.